The four horsemen of the apocalypse have challenged the imagination of every generation since the end of the first century. Moving relentlessly across history, they wield great destructive power over humanity. But are these ominous riders relevant in the 21st century? With an eye on the human condition, this is Insight. In the 6th chapter of the biblical book of Revelation, Jesus Christ opens a prophetic scroll, sealed in 7 places. As each seal is broken open, specific conditions and events prophesied to affect the entire world are revealed. Galloping free from the restriction of the first 4 seals are individually colored horses and their threatening riders. And I looked, and behold, a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. This vision reveals specific images, symbols of something intended to help readers understand coming events. The first rider carries a bow and wears a crown. The original Greek says a laurel wreath, the ancient symbol of a conquering victor. But what does it all mean? This horseman has often been confused with the returning Christ, described in chapter 19 of the same book, because he also rides a white horse. Many believe that the first rider pictures the gradual triumph of organized Christian religion beginning 2,000 years ago. But Revelation 19 reveals a different individual than chapter 6. The returning Christ is dressed in a robe stained with blood, wearing multiple crowns. The Greek is diadems, not a laurel wreath. He is accompanied by angelic beings on white horses, and his weapon is the sword of his mouth, not a bow. The obvious differences between the 2 images suggest that the first of the 4 horsemen represents a counterfeit or false Messiah. And this is exactly what we find in the explanation that Jesus himself gave to his disciples more than 60 years before this vision, as he told them about the future progression of world conditions. The disciples asked, "What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Jesus first warned that events seeming to indicate the end is imminent do not necessarily mean that it is. He said, "Take heed that no one deceives you." Then he added the first global condition to be aware of. "For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many." In a parallel account, the same deceivers claim, "I am he." Jesus' warning here about not being fooled parallels the first broken seal in the book of Revelation. He clearly identifies the white horse and its rider. People who claim to be the Anointed One are false messiahs, men who counterfeit the future role of the true returning Christ. A counterfeit is not easy to spot. It's so close that it could be the real thing, except to the trained eye. So Jesus warned against being deceived by human beings who claim to be the Messiah. That's to say, specially chosen and anointed by God to rule. Such people present themselves as the only ones who can solve all problems. Others have combined religion and politics in their efforts to be the Anointed One. Take the 4th century Roman Emperor Constantine. He's the man credited with Christianizing the Roman Empire. Yet his claims to be equal with the apostles, even God's agent, were not borne out by his behavior. Other more recent examples include Napoleon, Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, and Mao Zedong. All of them took advantage of the language of religion and its imagery, stirring up religious fervor, and got their followers to worship them, believing they had all the answers. Of course, all these false messiahs failed precisely because they were false. They also brought great destruction on the world, including their own people. In many cases, millions died because of their violent rule, their purges, and their wars. For a more detailed look at these examples, take a look at our previous episodes where we talk about false messiahs. Deceit comes in many forms, and the counterfeit white horseman will continue to ride until he's vanquished by Christ at his coming. Almost every one of these false messiahs led their followers into war, and that's the same next step in the sequence of the four riders. In the wake of false messiahs would come the scourge of war, represented by the rider of the red horse. Yet even widespread war would not necessarily mean the end was imminent. Take heed that no one deceives you, he said. Then Jesus added, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. In our next installment, we'll look at the second horse and its rider and consider the implications for us today. The four horsemen of the apocalypse. As we saw in part 1, the first horse was white, its rider representing counterfeit Christs and their ideas. The activities of these false messiahs lead to widespread war, the conditions symbolized by the second horse. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, come and see. Another horse, fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and the people should kill one another. And there was given to him a great sword. Jesus explained the meaning of this image some 60 years earlier when his disciples asked about the end of the age. Cautioning them, Jesus said, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. War has plagued humanity since the beginning of civilization. And Jesus said that it would continue to be so until the end, because it is a natural consequence of false claims, wrong ideas, misguided policies, and ruinous philosophies put forward by leaders with selfish ambitions. Napoleon Bonaparte is an obvious example and incarnation of the first warrior astride the white horse. He was famously shown wearing a victor's laurel wreath in both life and death. His leadership also brought the red horsemen at full gallop onto the world scene. Between 1792 and 1815, France was at war with four colonial powers: the Spanish, the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the British. Napoleon's aggression took his forces to almost every corner of the world. Like so many before him, Napoleon positioned himself as a messiah, but he proved false and he promoted the red horseman's ride. Joseph Stalin's 20th century record was certainly worse. Violence and war, domestic and international, characterized his regime. Cynical manipulation of religious sentiment underscored the duplicity of what in pure numbers was arguably one of the most murderous regimes in history. We could talk in detail about the warfare and violence of other false messiahs of the 20th century, including Mussolini and Mao, Cambodia's Pol Pot, and the Kim regime of North Korea. The story would be the same: totalitarian cruelty, imprisonment, and the deaths of millions. The red horseman rides in the wake of the false messiah. False Christs bring on total war. When Jesus told his disciples about the conditions that would long precede his return, he was also recognizing that human beings have certain tendencies. Like sheep, they follow false messiahs down the path to war, and they're inclined to accept the inevitability of war. But the red horse also has its roots in human nature and human answers to problems. Historian Victor Davis Hanson notes, conflict will remain the familiar father of us all as long as human nature stays constant and unchanging over time and across space and cultures. His conclusion is that war is an entirely human enterprise. The red horse represents the human tendency to rely on force rather than peace. Former U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower addressed the harsh realities of war when he said,
every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron.
War is an ongoing part of our present human condition, and war leads directly to the third devastating world condition. In our next episode, we'll look at the black horse and its implications for us today. Set free to gallop across the earth some 2,000 years ago, the four horsemen continue to pose dangerous threats to a largely unsuspecting world. In this episode, we'll discuss the third in the sequence, the black horse, and what its rider brings on humanity. As John's vision shows, the red horseman of war can be a lead-in to a third devastating condition. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a black horse. And he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine." More than 6 decades earlier, Jesus had explained that war would be only one of several long-lasting global conditions. In Matthew's Gospel, he added this warning, "And there will be famines in various places." It's well established that as war takes its toll, food supplies dwindle. War causes disruption of food production and distribution chains. People are often unable to buy what little remains, and desperation and theft spread quickly. In the first century, a denarius would be about a day's wages, and wheat for human consumption was generally more valuable than barley, which was mostly used for animal feed. The comment about not harming the oil and wine may be ironic if suppliers were profiting from producing more lucrative items like wine and oil and cutting back on staple foods, making famine worse. Devastating food shortages certainly happened centuries later in the collapse of the Roman Empire as invading tribes attacked the overextended superpower. In the 19th century, the black horse also appeared in sequence after the white and red horses when the Chinese false messiah Hung Shu Quan promoted himself as savior and went to war with his countrymen for 15 years. During that time, an estimated 20 to 30 million are thought to have died, mostly from famine and its natural consequence, epidemic disease. Joseph Stalin went to war with his fellow citizens in 1929 when he launched an attack on Soviet farmers. He was determined to wipe them out as a class. This led to a catastrophic famine and the death of 5 to 8 million people. In a similar move, Mao Zedong declared a war of sorts on his own people, a violent attempt to advance China industrially on the backs of the populace. Between 1958 and 1960, Mao ordered the nation's agricultural sector to produce as much food as possible so that it could be exported to the Soviet Union in exchange for industrial help. False claims were made about the country's improving productive capacity, and critically needed foods were exported. By 1961, farm laborers were being forced into industrial production. But bad weather, poor harvests, and a diminished workforce brought about the death of almost 38 million from starvation and overwork. Mao refused to accept that his policies had caused the worst famine in Chinese, if not world history. Instead, he blamed those party officials who criticized his ideas. The black horse and its rider represent terrible famines that had destroyed millions of lives in one more chapter in the history of human tragedy. Let's emphasize that many of these deaths were caused by delusional leaders. But it's not just lack of food that leads to famine. The precursor is sometimes a lack of water. Tragically, a child dies from hunger-related causes every 6 seconds. Fresh water is currently under threat for almost 80% of the world's population. Without adequate water supplies, food cannot be produced. Population growth and increasing prosperity are exerting demands on resources that cannot be withstood. Without coordinated strategies, the potential for disastrous consequences looms. The Earth has a fixed amount of water, of which 97% is salt water and only about 3% is fresh. Of the fresh water, only 1/3 of it is accessible. The rest is trapped in ice and glaciers. In terms of freshwater consumption, agriculture alone accounts for 70%. Added to this is the reality that the 3 largest countries by population, China, India, and the United States, are engaged in unsustainable water use in grain-growing areas. Complicating matters is the fact that both meat consumption and population are increasing. Industrialized meat production is far more water-intensive than grain production. So without radical changes in eating patterns, the already high amount of water needed for agriculture will only increase. In our 4th and final installment of this series, we'll consider the pale horse, its rider, and his terrible companion. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Each signifies a dangerous threat to the world. In this episode, we'll discuss the 4th in the sequence, the pale or pallid horse, and the great difficulties its rider brings. As John's vision outlines, the white, red, and black horsemen of deception, war, and famine can be the lead-in to a 4th devastating condition. In the book of Revelation, where Jesus is seen opening a scroll sealed in 7 places, the 4th broken seal gives the identity of the 4th horseman. Beyond the death and devastation brought about by the first 3 horses and their riders comes the next. When he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature saying, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him. In Matthew's Gospel, some of Christ's disciples came to him on the Mount of Olives looking for information about the end of this age and the beginning of the kingdom of God. Jesus gave several warnings about ongoing conditions that would typify the world's decline. And he warned not to be deceived into thinking it's the end when false messiahs, war, and famine disrupt the world. Now he gave a 4th condition, which, like the others, signals only the beginning of the process that leads to the end. He said, "And there will be pestilences in various places." This parallels the 4th horseman's ride. His horse is gray-green or yellowish-green, like the color of so many who are sick and dying. The rider's name is Death, the death that comes from pestilences, epidemics, and plagues. Opportunistic infections and sickness often come in the wake of war and famine. Malnutrition means that the immune system is suppressed in a way that's very like the collapse of the body under a full-blown attack of AIDS. Illnesses that are rare find a foothold that healthy people would normally resist. Under famine conditions, mortality rates may be greater by many times than normal. And during and after wars, epidemics can spread quickly. In the 1600s, the 30 Years' War saw typhus kill millions before it was halted. It returned with a vengeance in World War I, when millions more died in Russia, Poland, and Romania. And the Spanish flu of 1918-1919 may have killed as many as 100 million globally as soldiers returned home from that same war in Europe. In John's apocalyptic vision, the pale horse's rider is accompanied by Hades, the grave, the last resting place of the terminally ill. Then comes this summary statement about what the 4 horsemen have caused in total in terms of human life. And power was given to them over a fourth of the earth, to kill with sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. In combination, the riders of the 4 horses bring death to 25% of the world's population. It's a sickening statistic, even more so when you realize that much of it comes at man's own hand. The 4 horsemen's ride began some 2,000 years ago and continues to this day. Yet despite all the terrible death and destruction they bring, there is good news at the end of their terrible ride. The same Jesus who showed the meaning of the mysterious 4 riders will also come to put an end to their destruction. As the true Messiah, he will replace the white horseman's final false Messiah and his false prophet. He will establish a society based on truth, not deception. Christ will also come as the Prince of Peace, to eradicate the war and violence brought on by the red horsemen. One of Christ's other names is Yahweh Yireh, the faithful God who provides. So at his return, he will end famine by providing rainfall in the right season and abundant yields of food. At that time, epidemic disease and sickness in general will give way to the work of Christ, who's also named Yahweh Rapha, the faithful God who heals. Then the 4 horsemen will be no more, and the effects of their destructive ride across the earth will be a remnant of the past to be quickly forgotten.